Steve here with ICRPG behind the DM screen. In this episode, we will be trying to explain role-playing games, including ICRPG, to our non-role-playing game friends. Like and subscribe. Now this video comes by way of request as my channel has been growing. I've been asked by several of my non-gamer friends, what is the deal with this ICRPG? What about RPG, role-playing? I don't get it. These are people that may be familiar with Monopoly and maybe Catan, but in general, not really game players. So, I'm going to need help from you guys in the comments below. Tell us a little bit how you describe role-playing games to your non-RPG friends. Before we geek out and break out the D20 on our friends and the Polyhedral Dice sets, I think it's important to just give them a very brief overview of what role-playing games are all about. So for me, in very simple terms, I just tell them it is a group of people collectively creating a story together. That's pretty much it. Yes, there's dice rolling, yes, there are stats and all of that, but essentially we come together to ply our creative skills and tell a collective story that's always changing. I would say that most of my friends have at least heard of Dungeons & Dragons. It's been around for such a long time. It's obviously the classic forerunner, so to speak, of most of the RPGs that are out there nowadays. But they don't really know what it is. They only know of it as something that these sort of nerdy kids played in school, had something to do with, just mental stuff, and it was for people that didn't play sports. At that point, I correct them just a little bit and say, hey, some of us did play a little bit of sports at least, but I explain that for the most part, and this, you can tell me if you agree with this or not, but through the decades that I've been into RPG, I think that the people who gravitate toward role-playing games have been from a very early age. We're talking about elementary school, middle school. They've been readers. They are people who like to immerse themselves in other worlds and escape through the written language. That's a big part of it. So books like The Hobbit, Tolkien, of course, is a classic to draw from. Lovecraft, those kind of authors. We would read books like the Dune series, things that are fantastical, things that are adventurous. I tell them about, if you're into the classics, Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a classic example of the type of books that role-playing people would gravitate toward. And I realize that this may be a stereotype, but let's face it, for the most part, many of us who do play role-playing games at one point in time were not exactly the most popular kids in school. Some of us, we had those crowds or whatever, but others, for the most part, I'd say we at one point in time were a little bit of an outcast, or we hung out with the outcasts. And role-playing games allowed us, at least in part, to be a hero for a day. You could make up whoever you wanted to be. You could, at least for this adventure, be a strong person, even if you weren't physically very strong. You could be the girl that kicked butt, and was an amazing archer and saves the day. It was just a way of being somebody who you weren't for just a little while, and to enjoy that escape, and to do that in a community of other people who felt the same way, and you could find camaraderie there. And where else but in a role-playing game are you going to be able to beat up a troll or, dun dun dun, slay the dragon? Role-playing games, or RPGs, are often referred to as a theater of the mind, and where they differ from board games or card games is that there is not necessarily a structure. This is a collective storytelling event, and so things don't always go the way you think they're going to go. And a lot of it falls on the DM, or the Dungeon Master. Now, that's an old term that's used from D&D days when there were Dungeons and Dragons. So the Dungeon Master was the person that ran the game. Now we refer to them as GMs, or Game Masters, but it's the same thing. I'm old school, so I still call it DM, and that's even in the title of my channel, Behind the DM Screen. Now, what was the DM screen? That is literally a cardboard screen, usually, that was set up to keep some things private between the DM and the party. So the DM has notes or little whatevers, dice rolls that he didn't want people to see, and that kind of kept some of the mystery in it. So that's kind of out of vogue now, but I still use a DM screen. Now, a lot of pressure falls onto the DM because the DM is the one who creates the world, kind of does the outline of the story, where it's going to go. The DM is the person that knows kind of the overarching themes and what's about to occur to the players, but the DM has no control over what the players are going to do. You might be a DM who worked for weeks creating some cool scenario where these players are going to go down into a catacomb and they're going to find all this cool stuff, and they decide not to go down to the catacomb. Instead, they take a trip into the woods. So the DM has to think of all these different scenarios and tangents to try to drive this collective story in a way that's going to be fun and not bogged down. And a lot of it comes down to rolling these really cool polyhedral dice. While we're on the subject, let's take a minute to talk about these strange dice. These are polyhedral dice, and what they do is they represent certain probabilities of actions that you'll take during the game. So you'll roll different ones for different things. So for example, a 4-sided die gives you a 1 in 4 chance of doing something versus a 10-sided die, which gives you 1 out of 10. The most ubiquitous dice being the D20, and that is a 20-sided die. You'll see that in logos, and it often represents role-playing games in general. Now, sometimes what you'll hear somebody talk about is rolling a natural 20. That's because your characters in RPGs have different statistics that modify the dice roll, plus or minus. So you may roll a 20, but let's say you have a +2, it's a 22. Or let's say you have an 18 and then it brings it to a 20. But a natural 20 is when you actually roll a 20. And that usually means guaranteed success for whatever you want to do when you roll a natural 20. Versus rolling a natural 1, which means that you've failed. It's an immediate failure. That can usually result in some pretty bad things. So the dice go, again, in various forms. There's 4-sided, 12-sided, 6s. There's percentage, and then there's even, dun, 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 a 100-sided die for percentages. What I personally find fascinating about role-playing games is the camaraderie and the friendships that develop through them. Some of these games have gone on for literally decades with the same group of people playing week after week or once a month or whatever it is. And it doesn't matter if it's online or in person, but these are pretty strong bonds that end up developing. You become pretty attached to your character too. So when your character gets injured or dies or whatever, you have a lot of time invested in it, and you really feel connected to that. And I think that's one of the more unusual and pretty fulfilling things about role-playing games that you don't get in a card game or a board game or that kind of thing, is that long-term connection with other people and with the characters that you create. In summary, I simply tell my non-gamer friends that role-playing games, whether it's Dungeons & Dragons or ICRPG, Pathfinder, or whatever platform, is a group of people sitting down, enjoying their friendship, collectively telling a story together through characters that they've created to go on adventures and do great things. And it's just a really fun time of creating something from nothing. Really, yes, it's theater of the mind, but it's using your creativity to make new worlds and to do new things. So, those of you who have been playing role-playing games for a long time, please comment below. Let us know how you explain it to your non-gamer friends. Again, thank you for watching, and may your dice always roll with advantage.